Like Professor Khagesh Gautam, we went to the same law school, and I got my BA in economics, I got my LLB at Faculty of Law, and then I went on to do my PhD in economics. And the work that I do is mostly in the area of constitutional economics, which is looking at constitutional provisions from a positive analysis point of view. So much of what I talk about comes from that point of view. There isn't too much positive analysis here, mostly just legally, so we should all be able to follow. This is based on a paper called Incompatible Institutions, Socialism versus Constitutionalism in India, which got published in the Constitution Political Economy Journal. But I've amended it a little bit just for today's talk to shorten it. It's called Liberty versus Equality Amendments Edition because I'm mostly talking about formal amendments to the Constitution of India. My motivation comes from this cartoon. I don't know if everyone can see at the back. There's a gentleman here who goes to the government publication store asking for a copy of the Constitution, and the bookseller says, "Sorry, we don't sell periodicals." Which is unfortunately very true, as Satya also pointed out, in case of Constitution of India. If you want to look up this cartoon, you'll find it in Rajiv Dhawan's book called The Amendment. I think it was made specifically for it. What I want to talk about specifically today is one part of this liberty versus equality debate. So as Parth started the tone of the Constitution with justice precedes liberty in the preamble of India, and it's justice which is social and economic. So you can already see where the constitutional framers were coming from. They were mostly Fabian socialists who believed in some sort of intervention, mostly planning, though there were different brands of socialism. There was Gandhian socialism, there was Fabian socialism, there was full-blown Soviet-style socialism. All these elements were represented, but Nehru won in the end, and we went with a sort of Fabian socialist model in the economy. But at the same time, we had people like Munshi, K.M. Munshi, B.R. Ambedkar, who were constitutionalists. So we also have a very strong set of fundamental rights, which we've been discussing quite a bit so far. So I'm trying to understand if there's any tension between these two. And the prevailing view, you'll see this in every leading constitutional economics text, which is whether you pick up Granville Austin or Subhash Kashyap or anyone who's written about this, they say socialism and constitutionalism are synonymous with each other. They are so intertwined that you can't separate the two. So in a sense, what Parth said is coming true. We've kept social and economic justice at the highest level, and the rest of the constitutional principles follow below that. That's where we're starting from. This comes from a Fabian socialist view. So Sidney and Beatrice Webb used to say political equality is meaningless without economic inequality. And you can see this in this quote by B.R. Ambedkar. There was a time, the constitutional drafting process was 3.5 years. So during one of the many drafts, in this case February 1948, the Constitution was finally completed November 1949 and ratified January 1950. So this is sort of bang in the middle of that process. And in the middle of this process, he's voicing the Sidney and Beatrice Webb view, right? The soul of democracy is the idea of one man, one value. Unfortunately, democracy has attempted to give effect to this doctrine only so far as the political structure is concerned, in terms of one man, one vote. They never realized that it's equally essential to prescribe the shape and form of the economic structure of society. So at this draft constitution stage, we still had positive rights, which are now in directive principles, as part of the fundamental rights chapter. At the end of this draft, K.T. Shah and K.M. Munshi came forward and they said, this is a terrible idea. There's no way you can actually make positive rights enforceable. So they separated the two, and they made the negative rights part of fundamental rights and then positive rights part of directive principles. But then that all got ruined later anyway. But this is where it all started. Now, this idea that political equality or formal equality, which we think of under Article 14, and substantive equality, which we think of as the end goal of socialist planning or any kind of social justice program, reservations, for instance, any of these programs, the idea that these two are synonymous with each other, to me, is absolutely wrong. And the rest of my talk is going to challenge that idea. And the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to talk about what are the principles of socialist planning, because that was the dominant economic system in the first 3 decades. And I'm going to talk about what are the principles of constitutionalism, and then illustrate through constitutional history of various amendments that the two are in contradiction with one another. So that's sort of the rest of the talk. So what do we mean by planning? And here, when I say socialism, I don't mean socialism as social justice, which is how it's used in many constitutional law circles. I mean control of means of production, where you have price controls, quantity controls. You have a socialist economic system. So what do you need for socialist planning? Now, there's some previous literature to this which many lawyers may not be familiar with, but this is an old debate on which F.A. Hayek and Ludwig von Mises were on one side, and Oskar Lange and Abba Lerner were on the other side. And Hayek and Mises' position was, you cannot have economic calculation under socialism. What they meant by that was, without a system of property rights, which enables you to get market prices, you cannot calculate profit and loss, so you don't know how to produce, how much to produce, and for whom to produce. So the basic economic problem cannot be resolved by socialist calculation. And this was his main challenge to Lange and Lerner, who later amended their own position to market socialism, which I don't want to get into. But their idea was, we will abolish private property, and then every single means of production will be controlled by the state, and the state will allocate according to distributional values as opposed to allocative efficiency. So this was the main debate. Now, why is this relevant to constitutionalism? If the socialist calculation problem is in fact an impossible one, then you need to give so much discretion in the hands of the socialist planner that he can actually do the impossible task. So if it's not easy in a socialist economy to figure out how many Bajaj scooters we should make, so that there isn't always a long line waiting for Bajaj scooters. On that point, there was at one point, second-hand Bajaj scooters were sold at a higher price than first-hand Bajaj scooters because they put a quantity cap on manufacturing, right? So if it's impossible to figure out exactly how many Bajaj scooters we need in the economy, and that's one commodity, then to figure out the whole economic system, you need so much discretion in the hands of the social planner or a small council of people. Now, what does constitutionalism tell us? It says all administrators should be bound by general rules equally applicable to all without discretion or arbitrariness. So this is not something I made up. You can open A.V. Dicey. This is the fundamental thing, the first thing under rule of law, right? Hayek also follows Dicey's principles. So generality, norm, and non-arbitrariness is sort of your cornerstone for rule of law and constitutionalism. The next. Planning necessarily discriminates to bring about substantive equality. This is the monkey and the dog and the cat and the whole, yeah. So this is saying that the monkey and the dog are unequal. Or let me give the example of a bird and a dog. One has 2 wings, the other has 4 limbs. So the only way to make them equal is cut 2 limbs of one and sort of paint the feathers on the other or something, I don't know. Use your imagination. But the idea is you can't, if you try and treat them substantively equally, you can't treat them politically equally. You will infringe on their liberty, right? But the Constitution requires equal treatment before the law. This is another one of Dicey's principles, also one of Hayek's principles. Third, planning requires state control over means of production. So at the height of planning in India, which is Indira Gandhi's spate of nationalizations, you need to nationalize general insurance, copper, coal, mining, everything. Whereas constitutionalism requires you to have a framework of fundamental rights, and private property is the most fundamental of all the other rights. The reason I say it's the most fundamental of all the other rights is it came up in cases like Bennett Coleman versus Union of India or Indian Express versus Union of India. If you run a newspaper and the government nationalizes your printing press, is that a violation of free speech or is that a violation of right to property? But you can't have the right to free speech without exercising your right to private property. So this is that sort of a point. And finally, planning requires agreement over a particular plan. So it's not enough to say that we're going to make sufficient number of Bajaj scooters for the whole economy. First, we need to agree exactly what are the preferences of the entire country, that we all value Bajaj scooters over, say, Maruti 800. And then you need to figure out exactly how many people will need those Bajaj scooters. So it needs to be a very specific plan. And which means you can't have too many people trying to make that specific plan. Constitutionalism requires decentralized decision-making. Otherwise, you get the kind of authoritarianism that Mike talked about in the morning. So you need checks and balances, you need separation of powers, you need federalism. So in some sense, socialist planning, if you take it in the fullest sense and you go all the way with it, is going to contravene, at least right now at a theoretical level, with all the principles of constitutionalism that most of us can agree with. Now, the next part of the talk, I'm going to try and show you how this actually unfolded in Indian constitutional history. It happened with the very first amendment. So let me give you some background on that first. In the First Amendment, this is a time when there was still zamindari system in India, and the Congress government fought on the manifesto to dismantle zamindari. So this was a really important constitutional issue. But what happened was, as soon as each state started passing the land reform laws, they immediately fell in trouble with the courts. And one of the cases is Kameshwar Singh versus the state of Bihar. What happened in that case is the Bihar Land Reform Act tried to pay a poor landlord 20 times the compensation as the rich landlord to take land and redistribute to peasants. Now, this obviously runs afoul with Article 14. It didn't run afoul with Article 31 because they'd already diluted it enough in constitutional debates. The problem was an Article 14 problem. And instead of waiting to see how it plays out in the Supreme Court, Nehru's government said we must immediately do something. And for that, we started what has now become a long-standing tradition of amending the Constitution to overrule a court judgment. So it all started with the First Amendment about 14 months after we ratified the Constitution. So things that Satya is talking about is not new, and they've really been institutionalized by Nehru. Now, what happened in this First Amendment? The interesting thing is they didn't do any of this surreptitiously. In the Statement of Objects and Reasons, it says we're going to make this amendment to secure constitutional validity, which is essentially saying we're going to change the Constitution to become constitutional, which is a little odd, but we've done this a number of times since. The other part of it is that this is Article 31B. Now, what did they really do? They said that any act or regulation that we add to this schedule called the 9th schedule cannot be deemed voids on the ground that it is inconsistent with any of the fundamental rights, notwithstanding any judgment, decree, or order by any court or tribunal. So this is our first appearance of a non-obstante clause, right? And this is really opening the gates to all the other terrible non-obstante clauses that follow. So this is a backdoor exit for any constitutional constraint that your Chapter 3 fundamental rights provides. And they thought this will be an exception just for a few laws, just to get the land reform through, and then everything will be wonderful in India. And Nehru says that on the floor of the parliament during parliamentary debates. This is in response to Shyama Prasad Mukherjee. He says, it's not with great satisfaction we've produced this long schedule. We have 7 laws, and generally speaking, no other laws other than land reform should come in. Can anyone guess how many laws we have in the 9th schedule today? Sorry? 282. It was 285, 3 were repealed by Janata Party, but 282 as of today. So this is in the fag end of the Constitution if we actually get up to that point. Now, what did this do? This started a grand tradition of frequently amending the Constitution. So the way it happened was we want justice, social and economic, that's in the preamble. Towards that, the values that we have imbibed is socialism, which is going to be reflected through the means of central planning. Now, we have a planning commission which will create 5-year plans. Those 5-year plans will give legislation effect, like the Bihar land reform law, which was under the agenda of the first plan. Now, this legislation is challenged in courts and subject to judicial review. Because thanks to people like K.M. Munshi and Ambedkar, we have a very strong set of fundamental rights. Judiciary upholds those fundamental rights, and these laws are deemed unconstitutional. So what do? Parliament amends the constitution to retroactively give validity to this legislation. Now repeat this about 40 times, and you get the current version of the Indian Constitution. So this is exactly the framework that was followed. So you can move from physical capital like land to human capital on reservation, but the story essentially remains the same. You can just change a few words from socialism to social justice, but this is broadly what happened, and I think all of you are familiar as students of the Constitution. Now, the other myth is that Nehru just did like the First Amendment, which was a little bit harmful but not too harmful, but the real damage happened with Indira Gandhi during the emergency years. And once the emergency was over, we've been a wonderful, functional, constitutional democracy, and there's nothing wrong with us, right? That's sort of the prevailing view in the popular press, and this myth is propagated again and again. So I actually want to run through the amendments which were caused by socialist planning, very specifically socialist planning. So I've ignored all the other amendments, and I'm going by Prime Minister. So what happened during the Nehru years? You have a socialist policy, which is land redistribution. All this socialist policy, by the way, is trying to give effect to substantive equality. So we have land redistribution, which runs afoul with the constitutional provision of right to equality and private property. Consequence, we amend the Constitution. It's the First Amendment, which is Article 31B, C, so on. Then next, now the second plan has come into force, which is really the first time we're having full-blown planning in India. So PC Mahalanobis brings in quantity controls, price controls. Now, price controls can't be done unilaterally by the federal government. They are encroaching on state territory. So now you need to go back and amend the Constitution on federalism. So your 7th schedule was amended in this case. Then something like compensation for acquisition. What is this? This is trying to give different amounts of money. So they changed the word from compensation to amount. And then they said, oh, even amount doesn't give us enough constitutional leeway. We should just say differential amounts in different legislations, right? So from there, you again run afoul with equality and private property, and you get the 4th Amendment. In all these cases, I'm not quoting the case, but this was because of Kuni Koman versus State of Kerala, I believe. Kerala, right? And then, so each one of these is backed by a particular court judgment, like in the First Amendment with Kameshwar Singh, and each time they're trying to undo whatever the court said. Then you have further centralization of industry, which is again Essential Commodities Act, more price controls, more quantity controls, runs afoul with federalism. You have the 7th Amendment. And you now get the drift of where we're going with this. Now, what happened when Nehru died? His last amendment, which he introduced to Parliament, was the 17th Amendment. In the 17th Amendment, they added 44 laws to the 9th schedule. So by the time Nehru died, we already had the 9th schedule at a total of 64 laws. So this is not something that exploded later. This has been a gradual increase in the number of exceptions that we get in the 9th schedule. In addition, we got a number of exceptions in all the other articles also. Now we come to pre-emergency years, because the pre-emergency is in some sense even worse for formal amendments than the emergency years. Post 17th Amendment, we had the Golaknath case. The Golaknath case said that the Parliament doesn't have the right to amend the Constitution. So Indira Gandhi went back and amended the Constitution to amend the Constitution. There's no other way to say it, I've tried. But so she goes back, she amends Article 368 and says Parliament has the power to amend the Constitution. Now, armed with this new power and authority, she goes on a further spate of nationalization. So you start with bank nationalization, which is, it was first done by ordinance, then challenged under R.C. Cooper, and then thrown in the 9th schedule. So you all know the story. Then the next is abolition of privy purses, which goes again with your dog, cat, mouse story of substantive rights and inequality. Next is land sealing. So first they used to seal the land holding in rural areas. Now they started sealing in urban areas. And by the 3rd plan, because they said the holding size got too small and agriculture is no longer productive enough to meet the planning target, we need land consolidation laws. So all this craziness is going on somewhere in the background, but there are 282 laws, so you understand I can't discuss each one of them. And then you have land redistribution, in this case urban. It goes on and on. Then you have the external shock, as economists like to call it, which is your Raj Narayan versus Indira Gandhi battle, and emergency is declared. When the emergency is declared, the New York Times asked Indira Gandhi about this sort of authoritative power and frequent amendment of the Constitution, and she was again very open about it. She said we should be vigilant to see that our march to progress is not hampered in the name of the Constitution. So the Constitution is just simply something that must be amended to give socialist ends their due. What happened during emergency years? This we're more familiar with. Now, the 39th Amendment is most famous for throwing in the emergency laws, which is your Election, Representation of People's Act, Election Act, those things. But it had 62 other laws which were also thrown in, and this is things like MRTP. Between 39 and 40, it's your MRTP, FERA, copper nationalization, coal and coke mines, sick textiles, all of those things are thrown in under Article 39 and 40 into the 9th schedule. And finally, you get the crowning achievement, which is the 42nd Amendment, which undoes virtually everything that was done so far in the Constitution. So 42nd Amendment undid separation of powers. It took away independent judicial review. It severely circumscribed the authority of the courts. It said that the Prime Minister cannot be challenged in any court of law, the office of the Prime Minister. So you're familiar with all the authoritarian focus in the 42nd Amendment. Now, luckily, with the 42nd Amendment, we undid everything in the 44th Amendment, except one. Because Morarji Desai's government, and this was also Jayaprakash Narayan's movement, and they were all Gandhian socialists. Raj Narayan was a Gandhian socialist. Socialists said, right to property has constantly been an issue in trying to get socialism and social justice. We should just delete the right to property. And they, in a sense, it's a relief to students of constitutional law, because how long can your answers be? So they just ended it with the 44th Amendment. And Morarji Desai, who we hail as this great constitutionalist who undid everything that Indira Gandhi did, is really, I don't know what to say at this point. All the problems we have today in terms of land acquisition is because farmers don't have a right to private property. And that right to private property doesn't exist because those who were in favor of farmers' rights, like Jayaprakash Narayan and Morarji Desai, are the one who killed it. So it's all quite ironic at this point. Now, where am I going with all of this? I'm going where F.A. Hayek took us in 1944, but I just want to reiterate. So he says, a necessary and only apparently paradoxical result of this is that formal equality before the law is in conflict and in fact incompatible with any activity of the government deliberately aimed at material or substantive equality of different people. And that any policy aiming directly at substantive ideal of distributive justice must lead to the destruction of rule of law. He's saying something that's very simple and very profound at the same time. If you think people are different, you can't treat them differently and say that they must be treated equally at the same time.